Welcome to the Evolved Caveman, where men learn to be successful and happy with your host, Dr. John Schinnerer, as he shares the most impactful ideas and practices for you to get the most from your relationships, your work, and from your life. Now here's Dr. John.
Hello and welcome to the Evolved Caveman. This is Dr. John Schinnerer, and we are focused on getting men the tools they need to evolve towards greater success and happiness. And I'm honored today to be talking to Jed Diamond. Jed Diamond, PhD, is founder and director of MenAlive, a health program that helps men live long and well. He is the author of 16 books, including Healing the Family Father Wound, Your Playbook for Personal and Relationship Success, 12 Rules for Good Men, which is expected out November of this year. And the one I found greatly useful is the Irritable Male Syndrome, Understanding and Managing the 4 Key Causes of Depression and Aggression. His research on gender and depression broke new ground in creating a better evaluation system for diagnosing and treating depression in men and women. He's a blogger for the Good Men Project and the Huffington Post. He has been featured on more than 1,000 radio and TV programs, including The View, Good Morning America, Today Show, and CNN 360 with Anderson Cooper. Hi, Jed. Thank you so much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm good, John. Good to be with you.
So let's get into it and just tell me how you first got into the field of men's physical and emotional health, because you got into it way before a lot of other people that I've been researching.
Well, I think as is true for many of us in whatever passion brought us into the field that we work in, mine had a kind of seminal moment where this life mission of mine kind of began, and that was with the birth of my first son. And it was back in 1969. I was with my wife in the delivery room at Kaiser Hospital here in California, and as she was getting ready to go into the delivery room after 12 hours of labor and my coaching her through the Lamaze childbirth breathing methods, the nurse said, "Okay, Mrs. Diamond, you're ready to go, Mr. Diamond. You need to, go wait in the waiting room with the other dads." And I knew the rules, and I was prepared for that. So I left and kissed my wife, and she went one way, I went the other way. But as I was starting to go through the waiting room door, I couldn't go through the door. I felt like there was a presence, a voice almost in my ear saying, "I don't want a waiting room father. Your place is here with us." And I was kind of startled, but I felt it was the call of my unborn child. And I turned around and just went into the delivery room and took my place. They had the table, and my son Jamal was born shortly thereafter. And as I held him for the first time, I made a promise that I would be a different kind of father than my father was able to be for me. And I would do everything I could to bring about a world where men were fully engaged with their families throughout their lives. And that's really was the beginning, and has continued with my writing, with my counseling, with my teaching, my training. My work in the world is really to fulfill that promise I made to my son, and by extension to, the other children. Now that I have grandchildren, I've got 5 children and 17 grandchildren, and I've worked with a lot of people since then that I've hopefully tried to share what I've learned along the way.
Wow, congratulations. I really enjoyed the story. And, one of the things that really impresses me about you is that you've been so prolific throughout your career. And one of the book that I originally got turned on to you by is the Irritable Male Syndrome. And, I think I told you when we spoke earlier that there's very few books in this day and age that I read cover to cover. And I read that whole book cover to cover. Can we talk a little bit about Irritable Male Syndrome?
Absolutely, sure.
So, tell me more about it. What is it?
Well, what I can say is that it evolved from an earlier work that I had done. And before that book came out, I had been working on and published a series of books on what I called male menopause. Mm-hmm. And this was really an exploration into the world of men that nobody at the time had been doing. This was in 1997 when the book came out. And we knew that women went through a menopause, and we assumed that whatever it was that men went through was something like a midlife crisis or something, but not something physiological, not hormonal. And what I was beginning to see in my work with men at the time was a similar kind of response to change that I was seeing in the women. For instance, I saw men with hot flashes that if I had been talking to a woman and the guy says, yeah, I'm sweating, I'm sitting in an air-conditioned office, but I'm sweating, I would have sworn, this is something that I would hear from a woman. And so I began to do research, as I did, and interviewed people, and I eventually published the book called Male Menopause and a follow-up book called Surviving Male Menopause that, since then have become international bestsellers. They've been translated into, I think, about 17 foreign languages at this point. I've got copies up on my wall of the various foreign. But what we found in the significant tie-in to irritable male syndrome is that the symptoms that I was seeing and that was beginning to be reported in the international press first and then later in the United States were problems with sexuality, erectile dysfunction, problems with libido and desire. But what I was seeing in addition was irritability and anger that nobody else seemed to be seeing. And it was strange because I was thinking, why would men at midlife become more irritable? Why would that be such a high symptom? We were seeing it in 70 to 80% of the men that I was interviewing who were in that age range. And somebody sent me a rather obscure article from a medical journal, biology journal, that was from Scotland. And it was titled Irritable Male Syndrome. And this researcher, Gerald Lincoln, had found in his research to, interestingly enough, looking for a male contraceptive. He was doing research in lowering the testosterone levels of various mammals that he was testing, reindeer, sheep, any animals that he could test to see what you could do to lower their testosterone level, and could you, in fact, get their, keep their sexual desire, but to be able to have the testosterone low enough that maybe that would prevent conception. Well, it didn't work. That research for what it was intended, but as a side effect, they found that the rams, the Sohei rams that he was testing, became irritable and angry as their testosterone levels dropped. And they bite the cages, they bite anybody put their hand in, and when they would then raise their testosterone levels back up, they would prance and dance and do their mating, dances. And he coined the term. He suspected that low testosterone would be a cause of this irritability and anger that he was seeing in mammals. He suspected that it was a characteristic of all male mammals, but had only worked with non-humans. And I had been working with humans that seemed to have the same symptoms. So I flew over to Scotland and I spoke at his university, shared my research on human males and looked at his animal studies. And I thought, hey, there is something to this. So it started with looking at what at the time was counterintuitive, that if there had been any talk about hormones and irritability and anger, it was the idea of roid rage or increasing steroids of men who were doing weightlifting or bulking up for sporting events. But now we were seeing low testosterone really being the cause, and low testosterone was a much more common experience because, as you know, as we get older, our testosterone levels naturally drop, and if they drop too far, we become irritable and angry. So that was the first clue that led me to later research that looked at and began to understand there were actually 4 or 5 different causes in addition to the hormonal changes that Lincoln was able to recognize in the sheep and other mammals that he was testing.
So what are some of the symptoms of IMS? What do you see in male clients or men in general?
Well, we both, clients and men in general now. As part of the research, I developed a questionnaire that I gave to anybody who would take it. I had it published on Men's Health magazine, and for the study, I had probably 2,000 to 3,000 men who took it and women who took it, saying, "Here's what I'm seeing in the man in my life." And there were 50 symptoms. So, I put everything that I could possibly think of that might be a symptom related to irritability. And once the research was done, we found that there were 4 or 5 clusters of symptomatology. So there were things where the men were hypersensitive.
Mm-hmm.
Little things would bother them. Women would say, it's like I'm walking on eggshells. Anything I do seems to set him off. So there was that cluster of symptoms. There was, all kinds of variation of irritability, short fuse, temper, and seemingly not just in men who had a long history that they were kind of temperamentally angry people, but in men who seemed to be really nice guys, and all of a sudden, at a certain time, they became more irritable and angry. So those were a set of symptoms. We found that depression was also related, that men often who were dealing with these kind of cluster of symptoms also were becoming, more depressed. So this was what I was seeing in the clients that I saw, and then the questionnaire, we actually kept it on my website. It can, go to MenAlive.com and look under Irritable Male Syndrome, and you can still take the questionnaire. And it's been now taken by probably 60 to 70,000 men. It's probably the largest study that's ongoing of, what is this that men are experiencing, and then getting into then from a clinical point of view, how can we help men and their families? Because obviously part of it is what it does to the men and how they feel, and, being alternating between being angry and depressed, being hypersensitive, and then how that affects their relationships with their wives, their partners, their children. So it's really become a both point of emphasis for a whole lot of people to understand what's going on that's causing, their internal suffering and relationship suffering, and then recognizing there's a lot that we can do once we understand it.
So, Jed, what's the age range at which you see the onset of this? And then do you see any other peaks in irritability throughout the male lifespan?
Yeah, when we did the original male menopause studies, the clusters were between 40 and 55. They were at kind of midlife, which you'd suspect. But when I started the Irritable Male Syndrome studies, I thought, well, we'll start with those guys. And sure enough, guys at midlife who you knew had testosterone drops were the ones that were reporting in. But we were also seeing a lot of younger men. And what we realized was that the hormonal changes were one aspect. But we also saw changes in brain chemistry, number 2, and that seemed to be associated a lot of times with diet and how people were eating. We'll come back to that in a minute. The third was increasing stress, and just the general stresses of life that everybody says, are increasing, particularly for men, job stresses, relationship stresses. Then there was a feeling of changes in the male role as men are being asked to do more, and there's a lot of role confusion. Mm-hmm. That seemed to be one of the symptoms. And then the fifth one, which I've, kind of tuned into more after the book came out, which came out in 2004, and it's still selling well. I mean, it's one of the wonders you never know when something's going to catch on and kind of keep catching on. But 15 years later, there's still obviously an interest in that. But what's probably a newer and more significant additional symptom is the kind of stresses that we feel not because of what's going on in our personal lives, but are part of the collective stresses that are affecting everybody on the planet as we experience global warming, as we experience economic dislocations, as we experience increased population that's squeezing people more. So these are ones that are a little harder to personally articulate because you don't see it in your, right in your face. But I think everybody, as I started interviewing men, we're starting to say, yeah, I feel some worry about the state of humanity, whether we're going to survive or not. So those are kind of the collective symptoms. Started with midlife, we saw that, but then we see it in younger men, obviously going through stresses. So another cluster seems to be with young men between kind of early adolescence, so 15 to 25. In that range, we see a blip on the screen. Then we see another blip kind of in the middle of kind of our peak work years, and where you're just working your butt off to be successful at work. So guys in their 30s to 40s, that's another blip. And then men as they get older in the 50 to 65 group. So kind of three peaks in the but we see it all across the board. I mean, when we've done the studies and people take the quizzes, I've seen people take it who are as young as teenagers and as old as men in their 80s who are seeing that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to me because I've done a lot of work in anger management, and you have as well. And so it's fascinating to me to realize that there's peaks, and you even wrote in the book that there are some seasonal variations in testosterone and hourly variations in testosterone. Right.
Yeah, those are some of the kind of testosterone tests that we've been able to do. So seems to be perhaps related to the hormonal changes that are reproductively tuned in, but it also for instance, we know that men's testosterone is higher when we're mating and kind of out in the world looking for partners. So you'd expect it to be up then, but when we find a partner, we become dads, testosterone drops, which seems to be part of the biological desire to be more nurturing, more connected to the family. But in men, it can also lead to irritability. So we often will see that kind of irritability happen when new dads have kids. And at a time when you think, well, I'd be so happy because, the child we've been looking for is here. Often you would see this irritability that nobody would understand. Why is he like that? Why is he so irritable? What's going on?
Do you know what are the ways in which we can naturally increase testosterone, or what are the factors? Like you mentioned, if we're dating or if we're looking to mate, that would increase testosterone. Are there other factors?
There's a lot of factors. Testosterone. If you're testing for it, if you went to a lab, which you can do, and I recommend guys know what their testosterone levels is, just like you know what your cholesterol levels are. And what's very interesting is a number of things on testosterone. One, it's a hormone that is present in both males and females, just the way that estrogen is present in males and females. It's obviously much higher in males than females. In men, the total testosterone can vary between 400 nanograms per deciliter of blood, this is normal levels, up to 1,200. So there's a very large variation. And what's interesting then is as testosterone levels drop, if you don't know what your high levels were, the guys vary in their natural levels. Guys that are, naturally high in testosterone when they were young men may be at a 1,200 level. Another man who may be naturally lower in testosterone, genetic, if your parents had high levels, you may have higher levels. he may be normal at 400. So if you went to a lab and you checked your testosterone level, if you were anywhere between 400 and 1200, say when you're 50, they'd say, well, you have normal levels.
Okay.
You may have symptoms, but they'd say it's normal. But there's a number of different things that we have to understand. One is, if you were 400 when you were at your high point in your 20s, and now you're 400 in your 60s, you're normal, but your testosterone hasn't dropped very much.
Right.
So you may feel great. But if you were 1200 when you were in your 20s, and now you're, 400 when you're in your 60s, there's a big drop in testosterone from what you're used to, what's normal for you. So we need to understand what your normal range is, who you are, what's unique to you. So that's why I recommend guys even in their 20s, when they're not, concerned about low testosterone, find out what your level is, what your normal level is, so that by the time you get to be 50, or if you're under stress in your 20s and your testosterone is dropping, you'll have a better sense of what your baseline level is for you.
So I'm sure that the listeners want to know, what are some of the better ways to alleviate IMS?
Well, one is just recognizing that you have it. I've had people tell me, my wife or my partner's been telling me for years, I was more irritable, I'd become more angry. In fact, my wife told me this for a long time, and I'm not irritable, come on, get off my back. That kind of thing, or of course I'm irritable. Who wouldn't be irritable if I got to put up with all this craziness that, you're laying on me? So one thing is just recognizing it. People have said when they've come to my website, taken the IMS quiz, wow, I just feel relieved. So that's one. Secondly, what we know is that with these 5 causes, that if you can understand, hey, man, I'm dealing with the stresses in the world, and it isn't just me, it's part of living at this time in history, that can help. You start looking then more specifically at your own stress levels. So the degree that we can lower your personal stress, you're going to feel better. Thirdly, I mentioned changes in brain chemistry due to diet. So this is an interesting thing. We know that for many men, the all-American male diet I grew up on involved eating a lot of meat. This is kind of, in fact, my mother fed me meat, if you can believe this, 3 times a day, because I was kind of a small, sickly child, and she thought, and my father was gone from the time I was young. So she had this idea that, I needed to be, more manly. And back then in the 1950s, when if you were around in that period of time, you'd have a freezer and you could get all kinds of cuts of meat delivered right to your freezer, and they'd send you chops and steaks and all kinds of stuff, and you'd pay for a side of beef or whatever. And so, she'd feed me hamburger for breakfast, a chop for lunch, and a steak for dinner. That's kind of that was my diet. And because, you needed a balanced diet, needed some greens, she'd put a little green parsley on on the side of the meat. So what we found, and this ties into your question, is that when you have very high levels of meat, and you often don't eat carbohydrates. In other words, that idea of, the paleo diet or some of these modern diets that are very high in protein and very low in carbohydrate, they find that the low carbohydrates lowers the serotonin level in our brain. So the serotonin level is, that chemical that, helps us feel good and high and feeling, positive.
Less irritable.
You have low serotonin levels. That's where you become depressed and you take an antidepressant. Well, again, if you don't know that, and you're eating a lot of meat, and you're not eating potatoes, you're not eating rice, you're not eating, healthy carbohydrate vegetables, your serotonin level goes down and you become more irritable. So reverse that. If you change your diet and you eat a more balanced diet with more vegetables and less meat or no meat, I happen to be a vegetarian, your emotions go back up again. That's another thing you can do. Another is, and again, things people don't know about what we put in our bodies is if you drink and you drink to excess, and everybody's got their own idea of excess. It's what somebody else does, not me.
Yeah.
But, if you have more than a couple of, glasses of beer or wine, it can be excessive. And what happens when you drink, that alcohol increases your estrogen levels. And unlike, remember I said men and women have estrogen and testosterone. Well, testosterone can be changed into estrogen. It can, if there's enzymes that change your testosterone into estrogen. And if you drink, you increase the conversion of testosterone to estrogen. You increase the estrogen balance. So you have more estrogen, lower testosterone, and that can increase your irritability. And finally, and sometimes related to both of the above, if you put on weight, particularly around your belly, like we, in our society, there's 2/3 to 3/4 of us are overweight, and the little fat cells that are in our bodies and legs and abdomen convert testosterone to estrogen. So while we're working out and trying to be manly and eating lots of meat, we're putting on weight, and that's just part of being midlife or whatever, we're actually creating a conversion factory where whatever our level of testosterone is, it's getting decreased because it's getting converted to estrogen. So those are the basic things, the kind of obvious things, so you don't lose it. Then there's all kinds of other things, everything from self-esteem training to working out, improving your relationships so you're feeling more vital, more engaged, you feel more passionate about your life, you feel that you've got meaning. All of those things up your testosterone level. And finally, for men who, have extremely low levels, there's, hormone replacement therapies in the same way that women, many have taken hormones to replace what's missing for them. As they get older, men also have that option now that they can take actual testosterone injections or gels or other ways to get testosterone levels raised in your body. So I work with a lot of men, so it's kind of a science that's still not well known, and so I get a lot of people that come to me saying, all right, how do I deal with my irritable male syndrome? Or women who come saying, man, I read your book or I read your article, and man, that sounds like the guy in my life. Can you help us?
Now, let me ask you a question about that last point. I think there's a lot of women out there that say, oh my gosh, that's my husband, that's my man. He's got irritable male syndrome, or he's irritable and unpredictable, emotionally volatile. What's the best way to get this information to a man who may not be aware?
Well, there are two kind of related questions. There's just not being aware, and that's kind of giving them information. That's where people get my book, they find articles, they go to my website. There's a whole host, as you know, of information, articles, ebooks, things that can help people there. But one of the chief symptoms of irritable male syndrome is that men tend to deny that they have it. They're aware, it's not that they don't have the information, but it's threatening, the idea that there's something, wrong with me, or there's something out of balance with me. Many of us, and I know this is true for me for a long time, I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to deal with it. I was in denial about it. So I've developed actually a special program over the years that helps women or anybody who is concerned about a partner to understand, help them know what this is, help them. How do you approach a man who's in denial about this? And there's, as you know, dealing with male violence or anything that is a shameful thing for some people, or they feel bad about themselves and therefore don't want to look at it, is a way to help men recognize, it's nothing to be ashamed of. There's ways you can deal with it. And once men know that it doesn't mean they're bad guys, any more than, having diabetes or having, heart disease or having depression means, something the matter with you, you're a bad guy. It means you have an imbalance, in your emotional field and your psychic field and your hormonal field, and that it can be treated, and you don't have to be miserable. You don't have to be angry. So if men are willing, I see men in counseling and I guide men. If they're not, I help the women understand it so that they can, they can approach the man. They can do things that will likely get him involved. Like, for instance, one of the ones that many women have tried, and they like this. They will take the Irritable Male Syndrome quiz that's on my site and take it as they see their husband or their man in their life. And then they'll say to him, I saw this interesting quiz about, Irritable Male Syndrome. I took it and, I got this score. I'm probably way off, in how I see it. I don't know you. You'd probably, if you took the thing, you'd probably get a very different score. So the guy gets intrigued. Yeah, I'll take it and I'll show her. And he takes the quiz, and whatever the result, it becomes then a source of discussion rather than you're trying to force this thing on me. So that often works with getting men interested. Another one, a woman will buy my book, and she'll say, I've tried just giving it to him. He doesn't even want to look at it. So I'll say, well, you start reading it and underline it and make appropriate sounds like, ooh, wow, ooh, and he goes, what? No, you wouldn't be interested. No, this is a woman's thing. It's about me. I'm sure you wouldn't be interested in it. And so she surreptitiously leaves it, when she goes out. And of course, he wants to see what it is she's doing and sees where she's underlining things. And again, I'll have men call me later and say, got to tell you, I thought this was BS until I started reading it, and I read the stories about other men, because as you know, there's lots of stories about other men, including me in the book, where I talk about my own denial about this. And so once men feel that they're not being judged, they're not being shamed, they don't feel alone, then often they get very interested, because, we all want to feel better about ourselves, about our lives, about our relationships, about how we treat our kids. And nobody likes to be angry and irritable and mean all the time.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing those tips, because I think one of the things that's always fascinated me about anger is that anger dynamic where the angry person can externalize blame to infinity. So the anger is never their fault. It's if you would just stop doing this, I wouldn't be angry.
Right.
So I think kind of invoking their curiosity is a good way to go.
Right.
So can we switch gears a little bit? I want to talk a little bit about masculinity. And, there's been so much discussion about masculinity and toxic masculinity, positive masculinity, the man box culture. What do you think? I'd like to stay on the positive side and look at what is positive masculinity, because I think there are a lot of positives to it. So what does positive masculinity mean to you? How do you think of it?
Well, I think a lot about it, and again, I'll tell you a little story that kind of illustrates both of the things for you. So this is when I was 4 years old, so we're going back a long time, and I had, like all 4-year-olds of that era, I wore these little 4-year-old baby shoes that are these white, tiny little baby shoes. And I had kind of outgrown my white baby shoes. And So my mother was going to take me to a shoe store for the first time to buy me some kid shoes. And I didn't know there were any other than white shoes. So we go to this shoe store, and I'm wandering around looking, and my eyes are getting big, and I'm seeing all these different colored shoes. And I see it. Oh, I want those. And I'm looking at a little pair of red Keds. I thought they're the most beautiful things I'd ever seen. And so, we sat down, they measured my feet, and the shoe store guy comes out with 2 boxes, want to be sure they're the right size, and I'm, just sitting there, can't wait till the box gets open. I look in the box, and they're not red Keds, they're blue. And the salesman says to my mother, well, blue is for boys, red is for girls. And, and I'm just crestfallen. I didn't know that there was color-coded sex differences. I just thought what you liked was what you should get. That's positive masculinity. I knew what I liked. I'm a guy, I'm a boy, and I like red Keds. Give me the red Keds. So, the salesman kind of looked at my mother for support, like you don't want the kid starting life on the wrong foot or anything. So she kind of looks at him and says, give the kid what he wants. And he kind of, oh, all right. He went back and got the red Keds. I put them on. And so there's these 2 sides to masculinity. There is what I discovered is, the essence of maleness. In fact, that's what the new book is about. So there's a little kind of pre-interest in the book. So the book, the 12 Rules for Good Men, is exactly the answer to that question. So I've been a guy now for 75 years. I've got, 5 children, 17 grandchildren, and I've been in a men's group now that's been meeting for 40 years now.
Wow.
Part of what we've done is, well, what does it mean to be a good man? And what are the kind of parsing out? What is all this stuff that we've been taught is supposed to be man? You got to be tough. You got to be strong. You got to keep your feelings inside. That's part of what I call the man box culture. True masculinity, true manhood, I think, starts with appreciating a couple of things that, these 12, I call them 12 rules, but, you could think of them as 12 practices or 12 pathways to really being the man you're meant to be. For instance, I mentioned I've been in a men's group now that's been meeting for 40 years. It's the first rule that I have for good men. You need to be in a men's group. And the reason you need to be in a men's group is that's what's inherent about being males. We, through most of human history, were in same-sex groups. Boys hung out with the boys, girls hung out with the girls. It wasn't and there's obviously a lot of where you just hung out together. And we grew up, in boy culture before we ended up being adolescents, and we kind of then went our separate ways, and then boys get interested in girls, and they're heterosexual, and you go that route. But what I discovered is that we need to get back to what's the essence of maleness. And as part of the book, I started asking myself, well, okay, we get that men and women are different. We now have a whole host of really top-notch studies that have been going on for the last 40 years that show that male brains are different than female brains. Hormones obviously are different. There's a whole host of differences that are inherent in being male. They obviously can be modified by our social environment, but there's something essentially male about all of us. So this is a study that came out of Johns Hopkins, and what they found was that they found how many cells there are in the human body. There are 10 billion cells. So whatever the number, there's a lot of cells in the human body, and every one is sex specific.
Hmm.
If, you and me, we all have an X and a Y chromosome. When
Mm-hmm.
one from our mother, we got either an X sperm or a Y sperm from our dad, and an X egg from our mother. And if you were a man, the XY became a male. If you turn into a woman, you got an XX. Well, it turns out those differences mean something. They're not just, we got deeper voices and we got more, hair on our chest or wherever, and women have breasts. Well, it turns out everything is different. It isn't just male researchers. This is, I was just writing today about my colleague, Marian Legato, who started the Center for Gender-Specific Medicine. And what she found was that males and females are different in every aspect of our lives. Doesn't mean we don't have a lot of things the same, but this is the studying that I think we're getting back to. And what I'm writing about is, how do we get back to the essence of being male? What does that mean? And then what are the distortions that have built into a culture, and why is that has, put men in a certain box? And if you think about it, the box that tells us men are supposed to, wear blue, puts women in a similar box that says women are not supposed to wear blue. They're supposed to wear pink or red. And if you think that little vignette has changed, if you Google, which I've done, red kids, and I assumed that after 70 years or so, some of these gender stereotypes would have disappeared. Well, if you Google red kids, you will see hundreds of female exemplars of people that wear red kids, and very few males. Taylor Swift is kind of the female icon, it turns out, for red kids. If you look on red kids, you'll see a lot of Taylor Swift. So I think it's essential that we get back to the joy of being male, the gift of being male, and being able to recognize that part of the reason there's been this desire, I think, to try to take away the gender differences is because so often in the past, gender differences were used to keep one gender in her place. They were used that, well, okay, women can only do that. It was happening to men too. We just didn't see it. When we were told men don't wear red, and we're also told men don't go into elementary education to work with little kids because that's women's work. Or men don't go into nursing because men are supposed to be doctors. So it was more subtle, but it restricted males and females. So it's natural, particularly for females, to go and, and the women's movement to say, well, if we know we don't want to be restricted, well, maybe a way to get past that is to lower the idea of gender differences and kind of just talk about we're all human. That, I don't think, is the way to get there. I think the way to get there is acknowledging the very real differences in brain function, hormonal changes, what goes on in the cells, and recognize that difference does not have to be restricted to certain parts of our lives and exclude us from certain things that are male, whether it's me wearing my red Keds or women being able to be doctors and being anything else they want to be.
All right, so I'm noticing we're getting short on time here, so I've got one more question for you. So what are one or two of the best tools that you can offer listeners to become less depressed, less irritable, or on the flip side, happier in their lives?
Well, what I've found is probably there's two things, and I invite people to try these out.
Okay.
Okay. One is to start really embracing who we are as a gendered person, and begin to say, what is it that's really essential about being me as a male or being me as a female? Women have started to do this more than men. That's why the women's movement, women coming into groups and supporting each other. Part of me being in a men's group is this is a place where we can be, the band of brothers that many of us didn't have, or that you only get if you go into a military band of brothers often. So being with a same-sex group where you can really practice being yourself and being able to just be comfortable being you, that's one thing. You can do that as part of a group. You can do that if you're not ready to join a group, just hanging out and going, all right, what is essential to me about being a male, and enjoying that and embracing that. That's one. The second thing that I recommend is the thing that we know that is destructive, particularly for males, is social isolation. We know that women tend to do a better job at developing friendships, being more empathic, being more connected, that men, particularly as we get older, we lose our connections. We're not as connected to our boyhood friends, our high school buddies, our college buddies, the guys that we got close to. As men's lives get older, particularly as we get out of the work world, that we become less connected. And it's not surprising that the suicide rate, as you know, just skyrockets for men as they get into their 40s, 50s, 60s, that the suicide rate for males is 4 times higher than it is for women in their 40s, 5 to 6 times higher than it is for women in our 60s and 70s. And we get into our 80s, which is the fastest growing demographic in the world, we're just living longer, is that the suicide rate for males is 18 times higher than the suicide rate for females of the same age. So 80-year-old men, 18 times more likely to die by their own hand of killing themselves. And why? Because we're isolated. That's the ingredient that seems to show in all the research and common sense, is that we've lost connection with people, that we tend.
Let me ask you this, Jed. Sorry for interrupting, but I mean, I've encountered this a lot with my own male clients, where it seems to me there's a sweet spot in high school and college where that's probably the easiest time in your life to meet people and make new friends. After that, it becomes quite difficult to meet new people for some of these guys that tend to be a little bit isolated, a little bit anxious, a little bit depressed. They're not getting out much. They don't have the confidence to, put out a hand and say, hi, my name's John. What's yours? Do you have any ideas to help people become more connected when they're in that sort of a spot?
Well, it's a bind, as you described. I mean, it feeds on itself. The more isolated you get, the more fearful you get of reaching out, the more risky it feels. So what I look at it from two sides. The guys who are more connected can do more in reaching out to guys, because we all know the guy that's, sits at home and doesn't want to go out, and you might ask him, and we can be a little more, if we understand how valuable it is, that it maybe only would take a little extra pull or invitation to bring him out. The other side is really telling men straight out, like you would, a good friend, doing these dangerous things, whether it's shooting drugs into your arm, or whether it's, driving your car 80 miles an hour on the freeway, or whether it's drinking and driving. We recognize these are risk factors, and we would, if we care about that person, we'd say, listen, you need to not do that. But social isolation, they've actually done studies that social isolation has as high a risk factor for disease, as drinking and smoking. So it's a very high risk factor, particularly for men as we get older. So if we would recognize that as guys and say, yeah, I know you don't feel like it, but you probably are doing some things that you think are healthy, like eating better or exercising. Well, how about you add in a piece that says, maybe do it with a buddy, or join a gym, or go to a class, or anything that gets you in more connection with somebody.
Well, and I think to your point, I think, looking for a local men's group is a good way to go. I think, the other thing I've worked with clients is to go to a meetup and, incorporate an interest that you have and go join a local meetup group with that interest.
Exactly. Yeah.
But yeah, I think, there's an epidemic of loneliness going on in the US right now. And we know that loneliness can be as dangerous as smoking a pack a day of cigarettes. So
exactly.
It's definitely something that needs to be addressed. Well, in wrapping up, is there anything that I should have asked you that I didn't? Anything that I missed?
Well, there's obviously lots to talk about, and the time goes by fast. What I would invite, your viewers, your listeners, particularly around irritable male syndrome, if what we didn't mention, there are actually 2 books that are part of that series. There's the one you held up, the Irritable Male Syndrome. Yeah, and then there's that one.
That's the second one.
Now you're holding up.
Mr. Mean.
Mr. Mean. And what Mr. Mean came from, and the subtitle is, the how to deal with the irritable male syndrome. And it really came out of women and men saying, here are the questions that I want to know. So the irritable male syndrome, this is the other version of that. This is the hardcover version. If you'd see that.
That looks fancier.
Yeah, it is.
With the fist. Yeah.
But the questions that came out was, give me just real specific questions. So there's 32 questions that Mr. Mean, asks about and answers. And we've got a special on my site if people either go to the site or just email me at jed@menalive.com that they can get the Mr. Mean with all the answers to the 32 questions for half the price that you can get it on Amazon. And it's as an ebook, so you can get it right away, and we'll send you a link and you click on it. So that's something that your viewers might be interested, particularly if you're interested in irritable male syndrome. And I'm going to actually be doing a class later this year for people that want to interact with me more and get more information. So there's that. And if you just come to my website, there's a lot of free ebooks that people can get and sign up for my mailing list. There's lots of ways people can stay connected if this has felt of interest to you.
Yeah, and I would highly recommend Jed's newsletter. You've got about 30,000 subscribers. I mean, it's a significant list. And I got to say thank you for the Mr. Mean Saving Your Relationship from the Irritable Male Syndrome book. I haven't had a chance to read it yet because I've just been swamped, but I can highly recommend the Irritable Male Syndrome. It was just fantastic. So thank you so much for the research, the work you've done, your career. Thank you for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it. It was a great pleasure.
Good. Likewise, and let's definitely stay in touch.
We'll do it again when the new book comes out.
Good. I like that.
All right. Great. Thank you so much, Jed.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Evolved Caveman podcast. If you like what you've heard, support us by subscribing, leaving reviews, and sharing the podcast with friends and colleagues. For the latest, most powerful tools to connect with like-minded men, join the Facebook group at The Evolved Caveman. Follow Dr. John on Instagram at The Evolved Caveman, all one word, or join the email list by visiting guidetoself.com.